Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Anthropology 310 Origins of Human Diversity. It's the 16th of October. It is Wednesday of week 9. We're talking about peopling of the world. We talked about Australia last time. That's real far away. We're going to talk about stuff a lot closer to home. Clovis, it's even on the map, right? How often do you see a map of the world with Clovis on it? So we'll talk about Clovis today, why it's important, as well as one of the new sites down there at White Sands, which is changing our understanding of how long people have been in the New World. We will also, you can't see any of that, sorry. Still can't see any of it. There we go. Clovis on the map, on the big map. That's kind of fun. We'll also talk a little bit about White Sands as well. Sorry, let me fix this. We are going to, I'm going to try to cram a couple things in today over like usually it would be a two-part lesson. We'll try to do it quick. Because on Friday we're going to have a field trip, which seems super fun. If you haven't been over to the Blackwater Draw Museum, we're going to head on over. Where my screen's flipped again. What's going on? We're going to head on over to the Blackwater Draw. We'll meet here on Friday and we'll walk over all together to make sure everybody gets to the right spot. Somebody doesn't end up in the Rock Museum or the History Museum. And we'll do a scavenger hunt over there. There's 25 questions on the scavenger hunt, which you can learn about from the exhibits. Hopefully they haven't changed them too much in the last few years since we were over there. We'll do the scavenger hunt. You get extra credit. There'll be 25 questions. You get a point for every 8 questions you answer. So up to 3 extra credit points, which, if it's like a third of a discussion board, which you can get from just hanging out and visiting the museum. Yeah, so it'd be a really fun time. And it's a good way to learn about the site, right? Versus like me talking to you or watching a video, which is a little video today if we have time. But for you to kind of discover it yourself, if you're into like educational pedagogy, it's much more hands-on, kind of interactive thing. It's a really cool place too. The department, actually, we had a murder mystery over there last year as one of our activities. Who killed the famous archaeologist who discovered the site? And then we had to kind of solve the case. So it's a really fun place. And my students have also worked over there. You can see some of the things that we've done. We have some signage over there, which we worked on, as well as I have an exhibit on Blackwater Draw and Folsom and Star Trek, which you can check out as well. Okay, we'll jump right into it. We're going to talk about peopling of the world. That worked, hooray. When we talk about peopling of the world, we've already talked a little bit about how people got to Australia. Why was that significant? On big picture scale, like it's cool and all, but like, yeah. And so what does that tell us? Yeah, they had to travel there. They had to and it wasn't just like one guy who got lost and shipwrecked. He was like, now I own Australia. All right, you have to bring enough people to create a society, multiple societies, right, which spread out and kind of, yeah. Yeah, right. Got to see some of those mega Australian marsupial megafaunas, which we'll talk a little bit about similar cases in North America, and then kind of suddenly disappeared pretty quickly after people showed up. So questions about why that is it due to humans? Is it due to climate change, or usually both? It also tells us a little bit about having kind of greater understandings of the environment, looking at the stars and the tides and the winds, right? Again, similar to art, just shows people's minds and are expanding in their conceptions of themselves and the universe, right? We'll talk today about another part of the world, North and South America, and how that's in many ways kind of parallels the case that we saw in Australia, but also is a little bit different. So we're going to ask 3 big questions when we talk about peopling of the New World being North and South America. How did people get here? Who were those people who came here? And when did they get here, right? All these 3 are important. And the answers to all these can really tell us a different story about who, why, and how the settlement of America first got here. First question we're talking about is how. When we look at a map, show me a map. Today, map of world. Here's a map. Show me a big picture. Map of the world. There we go. When we talk about peopling of the New World, why would this maybe be, again, a significant kind of task? Why might it be difficult to get to the New World? There's what? Yeah, there's nothing connecting it, right? It's a big voyage, like if you're, even relatively recently, like I mean, you could fly to the old world in like 8 or 10 hours if you live in New York on an airplane. But even like in the 1930s, famous anthropologist Levi-Strauss took to take a boat for 30 days to go from France to go over here to Brazil, right? It's a far place. Yeah, I mean, it's really far. So the question, and much further than, even, Australia to Indonesia. So how did people get here, right? This is kind of a question that have been perplexing archaeologists and historians for a long time. This is something that's been really interesting for people for hundreds of years, for white people trying to figure out who these Native Americans are, because when they showed up, there were already people in North America. When did they get here and where? Originally, there was this idea, especially among European settler kind of people, that while Native Americans were living in the New World, that they weren't here for that long, right? Maybe a couple hundred years was kind of the default answer throughout like the 1700s. Why might that be not only a scientific question, but also a political issue as well? Why might it be in their best interest? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, who has rights to it, or who's indigenous, or who is time depth there? Because right, if you've only been here 300 years and we've been here 100 years, it's pretty much the same, right? So who are you to say that we can't displace these people, right? Survival of the fittest. One of the earliest people to actually look at this question was I went to the University of Virginia, and one of the first people to do any kind of scientific archaeology is this man, Thomas Jefferson, right? Founder of University of Virginia, third president, notorious slaveholder, and amateur archaeologist. Right outside of Charlottesville and throughout lots of places in Virginia, West Virginia, you're going to find these big mounds. They're burial mounds from Native American people. And Jefferson had one nearby his property, and he actually undertook excavations to show that these weren't Phoenicians or Egyptians or whoever, space aliens who people had, kind of thought of maybe had built these mounds, anybody but the Native Americans themselves, but showed this was, cultural continuity with Native Americans who live there. So this is kind of an ongoing, this is like a 300-year-old question about Native Americans and when they arrived in North America. So the first question is how they got here. One thing we've talked about is during the Upper Paleolithic is the time period we call the Ice Age, right? And we've talked about kind of the impact of that when we talk about Neanderthals, or Denisovans, right? It's really cold up there in some of those places, so you're going to have really good like parkas and technology for going up in the Arctic. We've also mentioned it a little bit when we talk about Australia, that during this time period when all of the water, a lot of the water of the world is locked up in those ice caps. And you can see this gray area on this map right here. Just shows you areas which would have been covered in glaciers, which are today uncovered, right? So a lot of water is tied up in there, and it creates different coastlines, right? We looked at that picture of Australia and Indonesia, and a lot of those things which are today islands were connected to the mainland. And we see a similar thing in up here, kind of in the area of Alaska and Siberia, this part of Russia right here. What we call today, it's the Bering Strait. It's a separation of water between Russia and Alaska, and it's not super far, right? Like, and there's islands in here, and then it still freezes over in winter. And my Native Americans professor has this interesting story from when they're up there of people who live, people live on both sides of the strait who are both Inuit people. And, family feuds where somebody was like, you owe me a sack of flour, and somebody like walking or paddling their kayak across the Bering Strait, bringing somebody a sack of flour, right? So this is connected, not connected anymore. There's water, but oftentimes this is a pretty easy jaunt in a boat if the weather's good, which it rarely is, or in the middle of winter, this is frozen. But 30,000 years ago, this would have looked really different. All this green area on the map, which is currently in the water, would have been out of the water. This is called the Bering Strait, or the Bering Land Bridge. Oftentimes, land bridge is kind of the more popular term these days because a strait implies like a narrow thing. This is pretty big. This is like the size of France or something like that. So it's a pretty big area. And the hypothesis for a long time was this idea that people in the New World came from Siberia, and there was some evidence, even pre-DNA testing that linguistically or culturally we see a lot of the similar things on both sides of the strait. So it led people to think that these are probably people from like Siberia who crossed over this land bridge over here to what is Alaska, what we would call today Beringia. Something like that, right? It looks like a megalith or megafauna Jurassic Park, right? All these kind of big creatures, giant horses and camels and moose and woolly mammoths, big sheep and wolves and all kinds of stuff. Saber-toothed tigers. This would have been, despite kind of the cold temperature, this would have been like an ideal place to be if you're a hunter-gatherer, right? It's like the Serengeti of the North, right? There are lots of things that you can hunt and or gather. So the idea was that people crossed over to North America, to about this part here, but were basically trapped because until about 14,000 years ago, you can see on this map, there's this little tiny place that's not covered in ice. So up until 30,000 to about 14,000 years ago, this would have all been ice. People walked over here, were having a great time hunting mammoths, but couldn't go any further. This is all blocked off. About 14,000 years ago, what's known as the ice-free corridor opens up. Basically, as the world starts to warm, we're talking about like right at the end of the Ice Age. Ice Age is usually we consider, it's going to be over about 10,000 years ago. So kind of right at the end of the Ice Age, the ice starts to melt. And one of the first places it starts to melt is right here, kind of on the slope of the Rockies. Basically, there's still snow up here in the mountains, and there's snow over here, kind of in the Hudson Bay Island area. But a corridor opens up, and the idea was that people didn't really think about like, oh, now I'm gonna like have an opportunity to settle the new world. But that animals, as soon as it opens, animals who are migrating start to walk down that way, and people who are hunters start to follow them, right? And eventually come down here to settle in the rest of the new world. So one interesting thing about this is that this gives us a limit on when people could have been here, because we know from geology and from samples of the soil that this area was covered in ice and was, like a mile high thick in ice and snow, and before about 14,000 years ago. So what does that tell us? This is all ice, 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 and nobody could walk through there. It's a mile high of ice glaciers and canyons and sharp things. Yeah. So it thawed, right? And so it gives us a real hard boundary for when people could get there, right? Because if that's your hypothesis, you shouldn't find any archaeology sites before 14,000, right? Because the ice-free corridor isn't open. We'll come back to that. Put a pin in that. So people hunting megafauna, and when we talk about megafauna, we looked at Australian megafauna. Last time, marsupials, giant kangaroos and koalas and wombats and things like that. Up here in Beringia, we're talking about things like woolly mammoths, the Columbian mammoth. We'll talk about them at Blackwater Draw. Native horses to North America, which if you know anything about horses, all the horses we have today are descended from the Spanish horses. So these were all living here at one time and have killed off, but same with camels, saber-toothed tigers, lots of animals which we don't see today. And we'll look at that more at the museum. One of the things that's really became a problem, though, actually, let me do this one first. And so for a long time, the oldest site in North America was right here. Did you know that? Clovis? Clovis is like an important place. It's the only field that I know of where if you tell someone you're from Clovis, they'll be like, oh, right? If I'm like in music or in art, they're gonna be like, oh, I've never heard of it. But if you go, I'm an archaeologist and I'm working Clovis, they're like, wow, that's like saying you work at the pyramids or something, right? It was one of those like really important sites during this time. It was because for a long time, our Clovis site, which is located on the base highway out here between Portales and Clovis, was the oldest archaeological evidence for humans in North America, if you can believe that, right? And this became this was originally found by Ridgely Whiteman. He is a local guy. He was actually inspired by an earlier site called Folsom. You know, Folsom is like up kind of in northern New Mexico. So this is kind of a little story, archaeology fable or story. So there's a guy named Ridgely Whiteman. He was inspired by this archaeological find at Folsom. Folsom was an archaeology site, or is an archaeology site, located in northern New Mexico. It was found by a guy named George McJunkin. George McJunkin was born a slave in the American South. He was liberated during the end of the Civil War, and like a lot of African Americans, went west to like be a cowboy, right? Because like during the cowboy era, he was like a ranch foreman up there in northern New Mexico. And he was also a buffalo hunter, kind of at the end of the quote unquote Indian Wars, right? He was out there hunting buffalo on the high plains, selling pelts to traders and things like that. Got a nice cushy job, kind of in his middle to old age, as a ranch foreman up here in northern New Mexico, and was out riding a fence line one day after a big rainstorm. And he noticed that an arroyo, like a canyon, had washed out, and there was all these buffalo bones which had come out of the side of the mountain. And him being a former buffalo hunter, recognized that, and here's some buffalo as well, recognized that these buffalo bones were similar to this, were not the kind of buffalo he was used to hunting. These were a different species of buffalo which he had never seen before, bigger and stronger and more primitive in a lot of ways. What eventually became called Bison antiquus. And what was really interesting about this was that not only were there really old, weird buffalo bones, which nobody had ever seen before, but they had found a spear point in conjunction with this, a Folsom spear point. It looks something like this. They're spear points like this, and they have this diagnostic feature, this big, it's called a fluting. So you make a spear point and you take a big chunk off of the top and the bottom to make it really narrow. And this was a really important site because it was the first time that archaeologists had found evidence that ancient Native Americans, were living at a time when these megafauna existed. Right, so it pushed back the date of Native Americans living in North America from hundreds of years to like thousands of years, right? So this was in the newspaper, right? This is in the 1920s, so this is like the era of newspaper and radio. And it was like a big story in Northeast New Mexico because there's not a lot of stuff going on in Northeast New Mexico. Oh, we found this archaeology site. And Ridgely Whiteman was like a young, like 15-year-old kid. And he was really interested in archaeology, right? He didn't have a degree, but he was just kind of an amateur kid who was interested and heard the radio reports and read in the newspaper about what was going on in Folsom. And he says, I bet I could find something too. And usually you're just like, that's crazy, kid. But he actually did. He went down to the local gravel pit down here on the base highway and started looking around and started finding things which seemed to indicate early human occupation. He tried to get an archaeologist out here forever, found cool stuff, and it took him like 15 years before they finally got somebody out here. Edgar Howard, E.B. Howard, he was the not only the guy who discovered this, at least archaeologists who gets credit for it, but also was the subject of our murder mystery. He got murdered, not in real life, just in our murder mystery, for the Blackwater Draw site. And we have an activity out at the Blackwater Draw site in just a couple of weeks. It's not this weekend, but next weekend, the local Atlatl Day. We do a big tour of the site. This is in the bone bed. You can come see this and hear the talk. We're also going to be throwing atlatls, throw spears at hay bales with pictures of mammoths and mastodons on it, just like the people did back in the day. What's really interesting about Clovis, again, is that it seemed to represent an earlier tradition. So this is Folsom. Here's a good picture. Show me Folsom. Open. That's not a good picture. So this is the Folsom spear point I showed you earlier. They started to uncover these spears, which were much longer, like this long, also fluted, and they seemed to be even older because they were found in situ or in context with even older animals. So while Folsom was found with these extinct bison and buffalo, Clovis seemed to be found with animals even older than that, these mastodons and mammoths and sloths and cave bears and saber-toothed tigers. And Blackwater Draw, again, was really important because we actually find evidence of where did it go? Of a spear point still lodged in a mammoth bone, right? So before people had found mammoth bones or they had found spear points, but it was the first time you ever found them together. And again, it showed that these people were actually living here at the same time. It didn't just like wash down to an earlier context. And this dated as we've done archaeological dating to about 13,500 to about 12.8 thousand years ago. And there's a really tight kind of range in Clovis. It's a really short period of time. Like you're like, oh, it's like 700 years. But in terms of like what we've been talking about in this class, like millions of years or tens of thousands, this is like a really short blip in time. And we find all kinds of sites all throughout North America. While this is called the Clovis site because it is the type site where it was found, in fact, most Clovis points are found out east. And not because there were more Clovis people living out east, but it's here's a map of Clovis. All these sites, right? They're all kind of clustered in the east, mostly because that's where people are like farming and they like use plows and tractors to turn over the land more than out west where you have more grazing, cattle ranching. But they're found all throughout North America as well as into Canada. And they have this really narrow range where people all over the continent seem to be living the same kind of way. Moving around the landscape, hunting these extinct megafauna, and living this pretty much the same, whether you live here in New Mexico or up there in New York or California or wherever, right? This kind of really interesting broad spectrum of life. It lasts a very short period of time before you get more specialized tool traditions that it seems like people who live out on the plains switch to bison hunting with the Folsom tradition, and people who live out east start to do other things with deer and small game. So that was the story, right? That was the story for a long time. Clovis, at 13,200 years ago, seemed to indicate that was the earliest occupation in North America. And this is actually a pictures, if you're interested, these pictures which are just living in our classroom, of some of these earliest excavations at Blackwater Draw. Here's some points that they found, as well as some of the archaeologists who did the excavation. And for like 70 years, that was the story. The Clovis type and our Clovis site here represented just the earliest population in North America. And this made sense if you follow the ice-free corridor, right? If we see evidence of, if we know this ice-free corridor opens up at 14,000 years ago, and we find evidence all the way down here in eastern New Mexico of people at 13.2 thousand years ago, it makes sense, right? It all fits together perfectly. But what happened? Yeah, you found stuff older, right? And it wasn't just like, at first it was like one, like if some people found things and it might be a little older and people were like, no, right? It's not really going to cut it. But lots of sites began to be discovered that were like as old as Clovis or just about as old at first, right? And these were far flung, like Clovis at 13.2. And then you found a site all the way down here. There's a whole bunch of these sites down all the way down here in South America, which were the exact same age. And people were like, how did they like go from all the way up there in New Mexico to down here at the bottom of Central South America in virtually no time? Or some of these sites are even just a little bit older. You're just like, how is that even possible, right? Another thing is that they don't seem to be going kind of chronologically, like with this type. We find these other weird arrowheads in South America that points to some other tradition. And then these are replaced like by Folsom and other Cody and Plano types, but they seem to persist up here in Alaska for a long time. And again, that kind of like gave people questions. And more recently, a bunch of sites have been found which pushed those dates back even further. Probably the most famous of these originally was the Meadowcroft rock shelter in Pennsylvania. You're getting dates like 13.4 or even possibly 15,000 years ago. Other sites, here's Manus up here in Washington, 13.8, Paisley Caves over in Oregon, 14.1. These sites that were like 14 and 15,000 years old. And then like a year and a half ago, there was a discovery found at White Sands, New Mexico, which just kind of blew those dates out of the water and pushed it back even further. So I'm going to show you a quick video about, this is only from 2 years ago now, just how these discoveries keep going and keep pushing our understanding of the past back. So watch this. Think about why these footprints are important, how they were decided how old a footprint is, and why this might be important for re-evaluating the Clovis site. Let me pause that. Why might those dates at White Sands change our perception of when and how people got to North America? What's the importance of a much older date? Mm-hmm.
Very low odds of like how people just develop similar cultures.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of somehow evolved.
Yeah, their culture has been here for long and it's had time to develop. Basically, what it does, it tells us that people are here before this ice opens up, right? And it's led to new kind of understandings. If you find one or two dates that push you back, 14 or 15,000 years ago, well, maybe this is wrong. But when it's 10,000 years earlier, it causes a reevaluation. And so people have kind of a new idea is that maybe people came like this, but also kind of bounced around, especially this northern route along the sea coast, right? These are, if you look at people like in northern Japan and Hokkaido and in kind of Siberia, these are seafaring traditions, right? People who live on primarily on marine mammals and fish and things. The idea is that probably you can take a boat and kind of bounce your way along the Aleutian Islands and the inland channels here, fishing and kind of camping on the islands out here, and get to North America much earlier than you could if you were going by ice-free corridor. And this is kind of the new idea. One of the issues, though, is that it's hard to find these sites because if you're thinking about the coast, a lot of this area where people might have camped is currently underwater, right? Because it was part of this expansion of the continent during the time of glacial maximum. But I'll show you one more video before we run out of time. But this is causing new researchers to look for these sites along coastlines, both underwater and on islands, which we might find close to like California in the Pacific. So let's take a look.
20 years ago, the prevailing.
So now we have these two competing theories, by land or by sea. And in like many good questions in anthropology, which is it? Do they come by land or by sea? Yeah, it's probably both, right? There probably were multiple waves of migration. And we're actually being able to see this better with the genetic evidence now, right? Just like how we saw in Australia. Before we had fossils and we had archaeological evidence, but now with the genetic evidence, we get a much finer grained picture. And it seems like, especially in South America, there's an early population who gets down there and then are replaced later by kind of later waves of people. And we've actually we can actually look at the DNA. Some of the earliest, the other question we had is where people came from. And for a long time, this was kind of debatable, right? Many Europeans like to say that it was Europeans who came over. But it seemed like they were Siberian based on the kind of the culture and based on kind of the morphology, the human morphology. But in recent years, we've been able to genetically test this. And you'll see this in your homework this week. You're going to read about a place called Hoyo Negro Cave in Mexico, one of the earliest burials found about 12 to 13,000 years ago. And found that this girl had DNA that was very similar to Asian populations, especially from Northeast Asia, like in Siberia. And we can also not only date bones, we can date poop too. This is ancient poop from Paisley Cave 14,000 years ago. And again, taking the DNA, and it seems to have, relationship to Siberian and Asian populations. But what's really interesting to me is that these are not exact matches, right? The DNA that we're finding here is not 100% the same as we would find over in Siberia. And there are a number of reasons for this. First of these is these populations were separate, right? After people moved to North America and the ice-free corridor opens up and they move down, and the glaciers end, that Bering Land Bridge splits apart, right? We got water in the middle of it, so you get populations on one side and the other. And it doesn't completely stop the movement. We've actually find DNA evidence that there was probably a couple migrations back and forth, right? Especially as those people still had connections with other folks on the other side of the peninsula. But after a certain amount of time, they split into two different genetically distinct populations between that. We can also find evidence that there seems to be more than one kind of migration. When we talk about Native Americans, oftentimes it's just kind of one big group. But we can talk about three major waves at least, and this is probably, I think it's more like 4 or 5 now. Kind of this earliest wave, the American Indian wave, which was often associated with Clovis. And like I said, the evidence from places like White Sands and places like in South America tend to like push us towards the idea that there probably were even earlier migrations even before Clovis got here. That's somewhere between 15 and 18,000 years ago, always getting pushed back. Na-Dene, which are people who primarily today live up there in Alaska, Dene-speaking people. But we have these populations in New Mexico, the Navajo and Apache people are related to them, arriving a little bit later, about 10 to 14,000 years ago. And then finally, the Eskimo Aleut, the people who live up in the Arctic, paddling kayaks and hunting seals, arriving about 4,000 years ago. But what it's showing us is that there seems to be a little bit more diversity instead of just saying Native Americans, right? That these are separate population waves, and that there was also not only movement in one direction over here, but also kind of backtracking back and forth and population mixing between that. So we're going to kind of wrap up here today, and we'll kind of just continue this discussion about Clovis, why it's important, and some of the challenges to Clovis on Friday when we go over to the Blackwater Draw Museum, and you're going to have a chance to kind of interact with the exhibits over there and learn a little bit more for yourself. So we'll end on that today, a couple minutes early. And I'll see you all on Friday. We'll meet over here for those of you who are watching online. We are going to meet in this classroom and we're all going to walk over together, but I'll also put a sign on the door just in case anybody gets lost. So thanks for hanging out, and we'll go on an adventure next time.